Welcome to Your Voice with Dr. Susan, a safe place to let your voice be heard, where personal stories are shared that break myths and assumptions. You will hear conversations that can motivate you in your own life to accomplish your dreams. Joining me for a panel discussion is the leadership of the New York City Chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. Hi, and welcome to Your Voice with Dr. Susan. I am so pleased to have on today's show the leadership from the New York City Chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Great. And so we have here Candida Brooks Harrison, who is the president of the New York City Chapter. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Nzinga Christina Reed, who is the program manager for continuing education. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Julie Kepner, who is the executive director of the New York City Chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me again. And I'm really excited to be talking about social work today. And I thought what we'd start with is if each of you could talk a little bit about your own role, what you do at the chapter, and a little bit about your history with social work. So Candida, would you like to start?
Sure.
Great.
I will start by saying that we are a membership organization, which means that members are elected to positions. So I'm in an elected position as the president of the board of directors. And we work collaboratively with our staff who implement the day-to-day operations of everything that the chapter wants to do in New York City. So as president, part of my responsibility as president of the board of directors is to make sure that we have set our chapter priorities, that we have a robust programming that social workers across New York City would want to be a part of, that we are the voice of the profession at the New York City and community level, that we are also advocating for our clients. And so that's part of my role. There's a lot more to it.
And how long have you been in doing social work or in the field of social work?
So I've been a social worker for 18 years, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, which means that I also do therapy with clients and children and families, my focus, although my secondary focus is about race, diversity, and intersectionality.
Oh, great. I'd like to hear more about that, too.
Yes,
great.
yes.
A little later in the show.
And
Great.
I've been on the board for 5 years, first as first vice president, and now as the chapter president.
Well, great, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay. Nzinga?
I graduated from Columbia School of Social Work in 2014, and soon after I began working for the New York City Chapter as a program manager for continuing education. And our continuing education has a long history, which I won't get into, but we've actually been offering workshops since the late 90s. I was more so brought in to restructure the program and make it more specific to the licensing needs. In 2015, a New York state law was passed requiring all licensed social workers to receive continuing education contact hours for their 3-year licensing period. As Candida mentioned, her work is around the race, diversity, and intersectionality. She kind of brought that lens to the chapter, and I craft all of my workshops to focus on what we call RDI, which is the race, diversity, and how these different identities intersect.
Oh, great. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, because that's a really important topic, as well as what clinical social workers do, too. So great.
Thank you. I just wanted to say it's really nice to be here, and thank you for inviting us. I have been the executive director at the chapter since January 17th of this past year.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. So I came in at a very interesting time, both because of where we are in this moment in time, if you will, in this country, and also because I came after an extremely long and incredibly productive tenure of the previous executive director, who really set the tone and set the bar high for what the NYSW NYC Chapter should do. So it's a hard act to follow. So let me just say that. I have been a social worker in the technical sense of that word since 2004 when I graduated from Hunter. But prior to that, I've been a legal services attorney for many years, and I've been in nonprofit administration in large organizations, often at the the nexus, if you will, of law and social work. And so, in keeping with what's already been said, and I know we're going to talk more about it, part of my goal is to see that all of our work, whatever comes out of the chapter, has that RDI lens. And I think that we're in a position to do very robust programming, not just in terms of CE, which is incredibly important, but just in terms of public education. And when I think of the NASW NYC chapter, I think about visibility, and I think about promoting and elevating all of the important work that social workers do in all areas of practice throughout the city.
Yeah, and that's great, because I think one of the reasons why I wanted to, for all of you to come on and really highlight social work in the city today for our viewers, is because I think there's a real misconception about social workers, that when oftentimes when you say the word social worker, people have this image of the woman with the briefcase that's going to the home of somebody in inner city and taking the kids away. And and that goes back for many years, but I think still today, after, we've do a lot of different things. I am a social worker, and but I think that people still have that image. So what I'd like to start by talking about is really on a national level, what social workers do in terms of the many roles, and then we'll get into more specifically about what social work in the city and some of the challenges that social workers face here in New York. And it's interesting because when I was thinking about the history of social work, it goes back a long time. And in terms of education, you mentioned that you just graduated not too long ago from Columbia, and actually it was in 1898 that Columbia offered the very first course in social work. And so that's really interesting. And so can anybody talk a little bit about, just briefly, the historical perspective of social work?
Well, we always say at almost every function that we are born out of the idea that we needed social reform and social justice. And that's where, so in 1868, this is where it came out of. And so Columbia, which is your alma mater, Columbia was the first school of social work to be established. We carry forward into 2017 the idea of social justice and reform. And so when you say that social workers nationally, what do? Is that we are in every system within the United States. If you enter a system, hospital, education, politics, you will find social workers there because of our history as social reformers. And our mantra is that we are change agents. So when we see that the society has gaps for all of the people, then that's where we step in to want to see about how we could organize, how we can make a difference in communities towards that end.
And it's interesting because actually the first woman who was ever elected to Congress happened to be a social worker too.
Yes.
So yeah, we're all over. Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
And going back to what you were originally talking about that stereotype, which I think we talk a lot about, and which I hear about at every conference I go to. Someone raises that concept, not knowing often that, number one, the person who might have done that wasn't a social worker, but also in the sense of seeing social work as an adversarial position. When, if you look at our code of ethics, part of our mandate is always to advocate rigorously for underserved communities, and that would translate into the present day in terms of any impacted community, any marginalized community. And what we do locally, of course, mirrors what happens nationally in terms of fields of practice. More and more social workers are also present in legal services of any kind, whether it's criminal, whether it's civil, because of an acknowledgement to the fact that we live in a society where all these systems intersect. And so the role of the social worker is key in all of these disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you happen to know any national numbers in terms of how many social workers there are, either within our country or that are members of the larger NASW?
130,000.
130,000 approximately, would you
That's what
say?
I want to say,
130,000. Yeah, because
yes,
there are
members.
some social workers that there's a subset that don't belong to professional organizations.
Right.
So we are the largest social work professional organization.
Right,
in the
because there are
country.
others, but the NASW is the largest, yes.
Right.
And also, just to clarify, that this chapter is the city alone, and that there is a New York State chapter which is everything but the city,
Great.
which also has a lot of members as well.
So I
Right,
think
we're
that's a
about
great
equal.
segue because I think that the New York City chapter, which you're saying is there's a New York City chapter, there's also a state chapter. And we're going to now focus a little bit more on what the New York City chapter does in terms of, and I know that you work closely with carrying out actually the mandates from the National Association. Right. So could you talk a little bit about your membership and what the numbers in the city look like?
Sure. And just to say, we interpret the mandates from national, and then we filter it through social work in the city, which is our saying, because social work in New York City can look differently than social work in a more rural area or in a other coastal area. So having said that, we have about 7,800 members at this point. And that is about equal to our New York State chapter. What it is that we've split the state of New York because it's so big and so vast. So the land area is vast, and the issues are vast.
I'm sorry. So when we talk about the city, just to clarify,
yes,
it's the 5 boroughs,
correct.
right?
It is
so
the 5
it's
boroughs.
Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan, Staten Island, and
The Bronx.
Queens.
And,
Queens.
yes,
Okay,
and Queens.
great. So that's the New York City.
Right,
And
it's
anybody or outside of that,
Long Island
and
and
Long
all
Island
the
is
counties
included in the state
upstate.
chapter.
in the state chapter.
Right.
Okay. Great.
Yes.
Great. And so, what do you see in terms of the different? Because I'm going to go back to the different roles that the membership does. What do your social workers actually? What settings are they working in? Because I know there's a whole list of them, but maybe somebody can address that.
Social workers, I think it was sort of dovetails on what Candida was saying earlier. I think everywhere you go, you're going to find social workers in the courts, in hospitals, in mental health community treatment centers, in community-based organizations, in the mayor's office. I'm trying to think of a meeting that I went to or a convening that I went to recently that did not have social workers present in some capacity. And again, I think that speaks to our expanding role in terms of addressing the fact that we live within a multifaceted society with intersecting systems that we need to pay attention to, and clients come to us in all of those areas with a whole host of issues that they need help dealing with. And I'm trying to think of some others that might sound unusual. I mean, there are social workers who serve in corporate capacities as well,
Schools.
throughout academia.
School social work.
Please jump in
And I think
and
that
military.
one
name
place,
some that I left out.
just one place that obviously can't be overlooked as social workers. A lot of us are activists. And so we are on the grassroots, pounding the pavement, demanding for justice, out there on the forefront at marches, at demonstrations, leading protests.
Well, and as Joy Reid mentioned, which we'll talk a little bit more later about, at the interview that I had done with her on this special day of social work in the city, she actually said it really started with what Martin Luther King was really committed to was really a form of social work, and he was a social worker.
Well, we were so excited when President Barack Obama said he had been an organizer. Every social worker in New York City was like, yeah, he's a social worker. And so of course we know he's an attorney, but yes.
And I just want to go back to something Nzinga had said about that we're on the front lines and demonstrating at rallies and protests. And almost all of us do that in addition to the rest of our jobs.
Exactly.
So we are social workers, we are social activists, we are social justice activists, all at the same time in the largest sense of social work.
And I'd just like to add, because of that, we have a really robust legislative agenda because we also hit the ground in politics, and we've hired a wonderful lobbyist who actually carries forward our agenda up at the state. And some of the things that are on our agenda are raise the age, which we know just was put into the governor's
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there were recently, from the legislative perspective, in terms of the subcommittee and the committee, a lot of achievements this past year.
Absolutely.
So if you could speak to some of those, that would be great.
Sure. So we are in coalition with other groups. So it's not to say that we only are the supporters, but we are at the forefront of building coalitions and being in coalitions. Well, there are only 2 states that were left that the age of criminality was 16. And New York happened to have been one of those states. And so the push was to get it so that children, and I will say children because 16-year-olds are children, they're adolescents, but they're children nonetheless, would not be automatically charged as an adult. Mm-hmm. And that was what the case was prior to this recent victory. Mm-hmm. And so right now we're looking at children moving into family court systems, children, this is going to take about 2 years. 18, I believe, is the
2018 is the
right.
cutoff
2018, September or fall 2018.
And what was the age raised to? Was it
18.
Yeah.
So
18.
actually being
To
an adult.
yeah.
Right. And those of us who work with children and families know that the adolescent brain is not the same as an adult brain. And we all know, if we can think back to when we were 16, that we are nothing like we were when we were 16. We think differently. And so this was part of it. So this was one of our push.
And just to clarify that, in case it's not clear.
Sure.
So prior to this being passed, which is going to
bill.
take 2 years, it's going to be
Yes.
implemented in 2018.
In stages.
Right, in stages.
Mm-hmm.
That prior to this in New York and one other state,
Right.
that children at 16 years old and above, 16 and 17-year-olds, when they committed a crime and they were charged, that they were charged and treated like an adult automatically without any type of consideration.
Exactly.
And so with this, with the efforts of NASW as well as other organizations like the APA and the American
Many
Psychological
organizations.
Association,
Yes.
many who are familiar with children and the way, as you mentioned, the way the brain works, that now, in fact, it will be that they will be treated as a minor.
As a minor.
Yes. Okay.
That's right.
Good.
And,
That's right.
you know, from an advocacy perspective, the bill was passed, and that is a victory. But there's also tremendous acknowledgement within the advocacy community, which we are a part of, that there's much work yet to be done.
Absolutely.
We, as is always the case with legislation, we didn't get everything we would have wanted.
Right.
And there are different pieces of it that we need to work on.
Sure.
There's much more discretion now, but not every case will go automatically to family court, although it will take a huge number of adolescents out of the adult court system. So most of these victories, as is always the case, generate more work to be done.
That's right.
Which is good. And we will continue to work with our
great.
coalition partners in that regard.
Great. And I think there was a few other accomplishments, actually, and achievements this past year.
Well, and also continued fights towards that end. And so we also are looking at, which is attached to raise the age in some aspects, because of course there's the intersections, is the Close Rikers campaign, which we are a part of, along with, I will say, Just Leadership and Cattell Institute as being at the forefront of that. 4 weeks ago.
Well, the mayor made his announcement on March 31st, and the Littman Commission report was officially released on April 2nd.
And there's 10 years for this to come. So, you know, in 10 years.
And that is to close Rikers.
Close Rikers. Why I said that they are linked together is if you take a number of children out of that situation, you already have depleted the population that would be housed at Rikers. It's also attached to things like bail reform, which if we had the children released to their families, there are many ways that bail reform could happen. Then we would also be taking people out of Rikers if we had a recourse where people who were paying $500 or $1,000, which is the case for many people who sit and languish on Rikers Island, were allowed to provide a different way of fulfilling their bail requirements. We would take a group out of Rikers Island. Rikers Island houses mostly people who cannot make bail, and the bails are not a lot. And we have entities like the Brooklyn Bail Fund that provides small amounts of bail to take people out. I think they do under $1,000 or less. They will pay the bail for folks so that they don't sit there. And we have people who, like Khalif Browder, who was on Rikers Island, and we know that story. It's a detailed story, but we are quite familiar that bail was denied him. And the result was a young person who wound up getting out and still being so traumatized that it ended his life.
And I just wanted to add a couple of things to that, the mayor announced a plan for 10 years. The advocacy community has not signed on to that, and of course our take on that is that almost 10 years too long. I want to say maybe 9.5 years too long, given the continuing culture of abuse on the island. And so, as Candida was saying, there are so many pieces that need to be put into place to successfully reduce the population such that it can be closed. And of those people who can't, 80% of the people on the island on any given day are people who have not been, their cases have not been adjudicated, and they are there but for the fact that they can't make the bail. So essentially they're being detained unnecessarily. And going back to the Khalif Browder case, we've also signed on to a bill that would push for speedy trial in New York. There's a federal standard under the Constitution for speedy trial, but in New York, it's very vague in the way that it's implemented, and so that's also part of the reason why people have ended up languishing on Rikers Island. Not to mention 40% of the people there with some sort of a mental health diagnosis. So I think, you know, we signed on to the campaign when it started, but the work of actually closing Rikers Island touches on almost all facets of the work that social workers do and what our mandate is. So it almost begs the question of whether or not it's a campaign that we would be involved in. And so we're capitalizing on the mayor's announcement and the Littman Commission report, but the advocacy community is very focused on all those other pieces being put into place to make it happen as quickly as possible.
That's great. And you mentioned the whole mental health issue, which is really huge. And I know social workers are actually in this country one of the biggest professions that actually deals with mental health issues in terms of being the providers of mental health care in this country. And you know, oftentimes people don't realize that it's clinical social workers specifically that are doing most of the mental health treatment in this country as opposed to other professions. And so if we could talk a little bit, and I know the day of in the city, which we'll be seeing highlights from, and could you talk a little bit about that? Because that was specific, I think, for clinical social workers to actually get their continuing ed credit. So perhaps you want to, this might be a good time to talk about that.
So it was for all social workers who are licensed, who are not licensed. We had over 1,000 social workers attend our all-day social work in the city conference, which was on April 18th at Hunter College. And 1,000 social workers plus around 80 social work students, which I thought was amazing that they came and they helped us out. And once again, the conference was for all mostly licensed professionals in the social work, so MSWs as well as LCSWs.
Can you explain? I know that's very confusing for a lot of people. In fact, I just had this conversation with someone recently who was in the field. So can you just explain the differences between the levels of a master level social work or a licensed, a clinical, an LCS, an LM, LM? That would be great.
A MSW is someone who has attended social work school and received a degree in social work.
And what kind of degree? A master's?
A master's of social work, excuse me. And you can decide to pursue a licensed degree, which the first level of licensure will be the LMSW, which means that you have studied, prepared, and taken a test to become an LMSW. That is a more general social work degree. There are certain people in the profession who want to do direct practice and work with clients. And if you fall in that category, then you would need to sit up under someone who is a licensed clinical social worker for about a 3-year period, collect a certain amount of hours, and then take another test to become an LCSW.
So if somebody was looking for a mental health direct practitioner, they would want to make sure that that person had an LCSW, because that's a licensed clinical social worker.
And not only that, is that an LMSW cannot provide autonomous
independent
psychotherapy. They can work under an LCSW. So if you're in a clinic setting or a private practice, the person doing the supervision has to be the LCSW, the licensed clinical social worker. And they gain their hours that way, and they can provide services. So when you are looking for a psychotherapist, make sure you have an LCSW or that they're being directly supervised by an LCSW. And that's like the internship. If you were a physician, you would work under in an internship while you're becoming the fully practicing medical doctor.
For our conference, we had around 36 breakout sessions, and there was a wide variety of topics, from clinical topics, every field of practice, to education, to grassroots organizing, ending mass incarceration, which is something that we're really passionate about. And of course, we had our two plenary speakers. One, Dr. Aponte, who spoke about applying the person of the therapist model to our clients, and our keynote speaker, who was Miss Joy Reid, and she was just absolutely amazing. And she spoke about where do we go from here? Where are we now in the social work profession with the new political climate, and how does this affect social workers in general, and specifically social workers in New York City?
Great. And I think we actually have a clip here, and it's her giving the presentation. So let's take a minute and go to the clip.
The perceptions of poor people in this country are very racialized. Public policy that's punitive toward the poor stems from that racialization of the idea of poverty. When people think of a poor person, they tend to think that poor person is Black or Hispanic, even though the vast majority of poor people numerically are white women, in fact. That sort of racialization of poverty has really been a feature of the way that the United States has conducted public policy since after LBJ. After the Great Society, which, by the way, was very emphatically and overtly directed not just at poor Black people, but also at poor white people. Because Lyndon Johnson was a man of the South. He came from the Southern old Democratic Party, the party that did the Southern Manifesto after Brown v. Board, where 19 senators vowed by any means necessary to resist integration. You know, it was after Brown v. Board that all those Confederate flags started going up in Southern capitals. They actually weren't even there after the Civil War. They were there after Brown v. Board as a symbol of resistance. It was a symbol of resistance. That was what the resistance used to mean. Massive resistance meant we're not going to allow the Supreme Court, these robed tyrants, to tell us we're going to integrate our schools. And so Lyndon Johnson, as a senator, was the only Southern senator to vote against that, because he saw where the tide of history is going. I always say that greatness is not about always goodness, right? It's about seeing the arc of history and being able to see beyond the curve. So Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, was a vehemently racist man. If you read the things he wrote, he didn't like Black people. He didn't want them around. He actually had this idea of deporting all of them to somewhere in Africa. He thought that would be a solution. He would have held the Union together and kept slavery going if that would have worked. But Lincoln had a particular genius, which is why he has greatness, is that he could see that slavery was a system that could not last. Whereas Andrew Jackson could not see that and did not want to see that and felt that slavery should last forever. So that is the difference sort of between right goodness and greatness. But anyway, I got off on a tangent. The idea of Lyndon Johnson's sort of greatness is that he understood that in order to sell public policy for poor people, you needed to make sure that it was sold for white poor people as well as non-white poor people. And so the Great Society was very much an anti-poverty program for rural America as much as it was for urban America. But over the years after LBJ, the backlash to the idea of doing things like Medicare and Medicaid, the backlash that still existed to things like Social Security, was really ginned up because one party decided that the way to turn a nation against LBJ and FDR-style social policy was to make people believe that those policies were only helping Black people, were only helping people of color, and that those people of color were essentially picking the pockets of hardworking white America. That message, which was pushed after Lyndon Johnson, is why you have such staunch opposition to a lot of social programs by people on social programs. People who are on VA benefits, but who say, I hate welfare, right? People who are taking Medicare and say, get your government hands off it. But it's Medicare, like that whole generation turned against the policies that help their families survive. Because public policy has become incredibly racialized and has become focused on the idea of punishment, on punishing the poor because people perceive the poor as not being them and their families. But public policy that seeks to marginalize the working class and the poor actually winds up being like a slingshot or like a boomerang. It boomerangs and it rebounds on the working class white voter too, so that in getting their preferred president, they may lose their health care. In getting immigration crackdowns and the wall and things they genuinely believe will help them economically, they may end up losing Black lung benefits for their families, for their dads who worked in the coal mines. And so this trade-off of giving up public policy that helps you because you think you're only giving up public policy that helps them is a real part of our politics, which is why I do this presentation about the elections. But what happens is that when economic want digs into a society, the society actually becomes unstable. This is what's happening in a lot of Europe as well, because eventually people realize that they too are the victims of public policy withdrawal, of the social safety net being taken away from themselves too. And while people of color over centuries have essentially learned to live with want, that's not a good thing, but it's true. Where we go from here really depends on Americans who have to decide whether they want to empower the first branch of government, the Congress, which is the most powerful branch of government, really. And that is really up to voters. Only voters in 2018 can decide who should control the House of Representatives, who should control the Senate, in a sense, who will rein in or not the White House. Because we have a very specific public policy imperative that one party versus the other has in mind. And if you care about what people of color care about and what poor people, including poor white people, care about, then you have a really clear line of action. The question is whether or not Americans will take it.
That was a great speech.
Joy is amazing.
Amazing.
I've been following her since she was at the Griot.
Yeah.
And so this is, it was really gratifying for us to have her here to speak about many issues that are so relevant to our chapter, to New York City, and really the country.
And I had the opportunity, as you know, throughout the day, and she gave the final presentation, so people hadn't seen it yet, but throughout the day, when I did the interviews with the attendees afterwards, everyone talked about loving her presentation and just finding it so educational and inspiring.
Right.
Actually, as well as Dr. Aponte's and the workshops. And people can hear about that on a podcast.
May I just say that Dr. Aponte is a giant within the profession, that he began structural family therapy. So many of us, I'm sure all of us at the table, took his class or used the book that he wrote, which was in family therapy.
And his specialty was actually multicultural.
And that's exactly right.
And so that was so wonderful. I too studied about him.
Right.
And I also had the opportunity to interview him.
Yes.
It was really unfortunately only audio, but that too you'll get to hear in a podcast. And that was just a wonderful presentation. Earlier you mentioned RDI. Can you explain more about that?
The race, diversity, and intersectionality lens is from which we view everything. And what we do is, since we are born out of social justice and reform, we know that there are intersections between people's identity that falls across all areas of diversity. So diversity of language, diversity of ability, diversity of ableism. And then we also know that race leads in this country. So we look at race, and then we look at the other areas of diversity and how they intersect within social systems and with each other. So each one of us here have many dimensions of our identity, and that's how we see the world. That's how we walk through the world. And that's how the world engages with us, to be quite frank. It engages with us first, sees race, then everything else that follows. And so
I do want to point out that Candida is the person who actually coined that term and who brought that to our chapter. And as I mentioned earlier, everything that we do in regards to our programming, especially me with my continuing education workshops and the conference in general, we make sure that each workshop, each presenter has that RDI lens to make sure that our social workers here in New York are receiving adequate training, because New York is so diverse. So we want to make sure that each presenter has that RDI lens when doing any type of teaching or seminar.
I just wanted to add that along those lines, we also take it seriously to the point where sometimes we get feedback about our workshops and the conference, and people say, well, I didn't think that this workshop really was seen through that lens in an appropriate way. And then we follow up on that.
Exactly.
And we talk with the workshop organizer, or we try and figure out what happened. And sometimes, even though they're reviewed carefully, and you look at something on paper, and it looks like it is really well articulated through that lens, but then in the delivery of the workshop itself, it's not either perceived that way by the workshop participants. This is ongoing work, I think, really in every facet of what we do.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit, or have you talk a little bit about how that then is, the social worker would use that on a practical basis. I teach actually psychology, and when I teach intro to psych, I always stress in almost every single topic the importance of taking that cultural and racial lens with you, no matter what you're looking at, because it's so important to consider that and always have that and know when to pull it out. And so, if you could talk to how that, like the social worker, really on a usage basis, like that social worker, whatever setting they're in, whether it's in the schools, whether it's in doing public advocating, whatever setting, how would then they use it on a practical basis so that people can have the understanding of that?
So I think that that's an excellent question and goes to what Julie just said, is that sometimes people think that they're actually carrying forward an RDI lens. They write about it, but when you see it in practice, it's not there. And so just the idea of raising that this affects different groups differently is not enough. It has to move towards from the theory of it to the practice of it. And so what does it look like? When you're working with, say, I'll just talk about ACS right now since I've been working with people in child welfare.
Just say what ACS means
Administration for Children's Services. But what I wanted to say is that when we look at how child welfare across the country is implemented, we think not just that people come in and take your children away, but people save lives there, right? If not for these entities, lives would be lost. But what does it look like when there are disproportionate removals? What does it look like when different groups of people are treated differently within a system? That's what RDI says. What is the unintended cost of saving lives? Do we treat people differently? And what is the recourse for helping to reduce those disparities? And I was fortunate to sit on a commissioner's panel where they had commissioners from administrations for children's services, whatever the respective names are in those states, and they all talked about disparities across. And within the disparities were things like implicit bias, where people don't intend to be biased, but yet they are. And so when they look at one family, they see, just discipline, and in another family, they see abuse. There has to be some kind of training and awareness of RDI and myriad of ways that it filters through our own biases, because everyone is biased. Absolutely. We all come with the biases, so we have to examine them. And so that's what RDI is really about, is looking at it.
What comes to mind is the study that was done with children in schools from an early age, and I think this is a good example of how it's real and practical in terms of when children of color were found to have a behavior in a school at a young age, kindergarten, first grade, that child of color was treated differently from the start than a child who was not of color. And it started there then. And what they found was that, if you punish a child of color in a different way, let's say that child got suspended for something where a white child would not get suspended. And people were not even realizing until this study came out that that's what was happening, to identify that why are people of color being treated differently, and to question, is that happening? And that's what it reminded me of.
I would beg to differ on one small part. I think that people in communities of color have known for years that was happening.
Right.
I think when studies were done
when the studies came out, then everybody,
then white people, academic people stood up and took notice and said, oh, that's why we ended up with something called the school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
And it was because of those systems that are put into place so early on that criminalize children of color and funnel them into the justice system.
Thank you for saying that, because that's the implicit bias, is that you don't see it. You don't realize. Because from a place of privilege, if that doesn't affect you, it's like being a fish in water. You don't realize you're breathing water until they throw you on the shore, and then you're flopping around, right? And you realize, wait, there's a difference here that's going on. So as social workers, we always have to shape our lens to make sure that we actually see it, because if we don't see it, we can't do anything about it.
And I wanted to just also speak about RDI on the public policy end as well, or in community organizing, which Nzinga was talking about, what that means is that we align ourselves with organizations that are led by individuals that are directly impacted by the issue at hand, as opposed to a group of well-intentioned people deciding what the solution is to a problem that they have not experienced. So a good example of that would be Just Leadership, which is an organization which is directly led and policy informed by individuals who have direct experience with the criminal justice system. And in New York, there are many, many, many organizations that mirror that model, and those are the organizations that we seek to align ourselves with.
Right. Great. Great. So that's one of the big challenges in terms of I see social workers in the city really having in terms of incorporating the racial and ethnic considerations in terms of what's been going on. What other kinds of challenges do you see that social workers have in terms of the actual work right now that's going on in the city for social workers, and whether it's political, what kind of challenges do you see right now?
Well, one of the things I'm just going to say that we are looking at and keeping a very close eye on are what will be the policies that will come down because, of course, we work in systems. So at the federal level, the policies will trickle down to the state and then to the local level. We are keeping a watchful eye. One of the ones that we are really interested in, well, we're interested in so many, but one important is how will healthcare affect the way we are able to carry out services. One of the wonderful things that did happen is that there had been a lot of focus by the previous administration, both at the federal and state and local level, around making sure that people would have access to mental health services. And so mental health services were offered to everyone under their policies. Now we're looking at the idea that they won't be, and that it's optional. And if it's optional for those who are not aware of any mental health issues, when it comes up in our families and we know that everyone is touched, we are probably 2 degrees of separation. We know someone who knows someone if it's not ourselves or the person next to us. So mental health in America is a critical issue, and under new policies that affect healthcare, it may become a horrific problem.
We were talking earlier today, Julie and I, just about New York City being a sanctuary city and having so many immigrants. I myself am married to a immigrant, and just the uncertainty, of ICE coming to your neighborhoods and kind of destroying communities, and what that does to not only the individual, but the family system and the community system as a whole. Julie can talk more about that, because we're thinking about what it is that we can do as a chapter to prepare social workers in the field who work with clients that are immigrants.
And so many of those questions abound, and so much of it also touches on clinical practice as well. We've been approached by a lot of social workers since January and February, when the first executive orders on immigration started coming down, and social workers who work in all facets of that field: immigration, legal services, unaccompanied minors, families awaiting resolution of asylum applications, all of the above, with big questions about what do we do, how do families make safety plans. And we started sharing information through our network that we were calling from legal services organizations and other organizations about what to do, what's fact, what's fiction, know your rights. But as we know, there's a real gap between knowing your rights and being able to exercise them, and then there's the fear factor. And I just want to say briefly that we were at a forum at Fordham Law School yesterday, which the room was full of social workers, of course, many from ACS, talking and really drilling down on what do we do, what do we tell our clients? What if a client feels that kinship foster care might put another family member in danger because then they're in the system? How do we advise them? How do we advise children who are terrified that their parents will now be deported? And so these are questions that we need to help social workers answer as best as we can at this moment. And that was the consensus in the room. It's one of those, this is what we know and this is what we don't know, and this is how we can prepare at this moment. And we all acknowledge that our jobs have become much more, they were always not crisis-oriented, but so much in the moment, and now even more so in terms of a changing landscape. But that has fostered tremendous collaboration between city agencies, community groups, to say, how can we really provide that supporting network to people, and at the same time acknowledge, because we're talking about what these children are experiencing, and I'm thinking trauma, PTSD, how will that be addressed from a clinical perspective, and how can we support social workers who are exhausted in the field from doing this work?
And I see it a lot with teachers talking about their students talking about it, and I think this is a real good example, unfortunately, of how what happens in our society, what happens in terms of our culture and our ethnicities, in terms of the stress levels that then trickle down to the families and the children, so that if you have somebody coming into a clinical practice and saying, I'm really anxious, well, you can't just look at, just anxiety as a disorder. It's, well, what is happening? Yes, I'm really afraid because, this student said my mommy's going to be shipped off because blah, blah, blah. And so it's real and it's so important. And I want to, with that, I'd like to just, because I think that's such a great issue that we're all going to be working on and paying attention to. And just shift a little bit, because you mentioned that your husband's an immigrant. And just I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about each of you personally in terms of what got you into social work and what people would be surprised to maybe know about you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Outside of working at NYSW, I have my own nonprofit called Black Diaries, which shares the personal narratives of people of color. And so I'm constantly working on that, similar to you, doing interviews, going into the community and just seeing how people are living. Like, what is the issue of the day? What is it like to be undocumented? What is it like to have your parent or your family member incarcerated, or to be falsely incarcerated? One of the people who were on my board is Yusuf Salam of the Central Park Five. And so just sitting in front of him, interviewing him, like, what was that experience like for you, and what does that do to your psyche and to the community, and as we know, to the nation as a whole in his particular case?
Well, great. So maybe you can come back on a future show and just talk about that work, because that's really interesting.
And it's
that
phenomenal
would be great.
work
I think that would be
doing.
wonderful.
Yeah, so that's pretty much what I'm in, besides being a mother.
A mother. Yeah, you recently a new mother. Great. Great. Thanks. Yeah.
What you might not know about me as a social worker. Actually, that gives me an opportunity to go back and clarify my introduction, which is, I said, technically I've been a social worker since 2004 when I graduated from Hunter. What I meant by that is that I feel like I've always been a social worker. So that's what I really wanted you to know. In the largest senses of that word, very early on in life, my mother said, why did you choose such a hard path? And I said, I didn't choose the path, it chose me. And one of my professors at Hunter, all of whom were good, I had a wonderful experience at Hunter, and I obviously came to it much later in life.
Yeah, because you were an attorney first, right?
For a long time, since 1988. And she said, did you come out of the womb questioning authority? In front of the whole class. And I said, probably. And that's a good part of being a social worker, is that you question the status quo, you question the systems, you question what people said they didn't know. You question all of the above. And so I like to think that infuses all of the work that I do. And I think I've been a social justice advocate for a long time. And I think I went to social work school for a reason at that moment in time, because I had thought about doing it years and years ago when I first graduated from college. I went because I wanted to deepen the work that I did. I wanted to deepen my ability to understand other individuals and group processes and how people function together as groups. And regardless of whether or not, I didn't have the intention of doing a lot of clinical practice after I came out, which was fine. But the learning in social work school, I think, really deepened my ability to be intentional about everything I've done since then.
Wonderful.
I'll say I'm a child of the 60s, number one, which means that I grew up with older siblings and in an African-American family that had activists.
Was that in New York?
In New York City. I'm born in New York City, even though my people are not necessarily from here. So I don't think I had any choice but to go into social work because social work was the field that is everywhere. And when I say that, I really mean it. And it's at the forefront of social justice and reform. So I had a dad who had to fight to get into the military in World War II and served on a submarine. And they told him he's half African American and half Native. And they said, well, why don't you use your Native status to get in? Because they were taking Indians, as they said, but not Negroes. And then moved on through the 60s with a brother who, people nowadays know more about, but he was a Black Panther. And I went to feed lunch, breakfast and lunch when I was like 5 and 6 years old when he was in the community doing this. So I don't think I really had a choice because I was well aware. And I grew up in a neighborhood that was filled with everyone. So my whole idea about diversity across all, areas and identities is out of that time. And everyone in the 60s, white women with afros and dashikis. And I was like, those were my teachers. So I grew up in an exciting time, or at least my formative years. Scroll forward, I am a special educator as well as a social worker. So people who have differing abilities are also an area. When I look at race and then the diversity, and where it intersects, I understand that. Social workers take into account that there is a context for everyone's lives, and that context shapes how we view the world and each other and how we engage with each other. So
that's great.
That's great. Me. 4 kids.
Wow, congratulations. That's great. Any last words that you would want anybody to know about social work, the profession, or just social workers? Any last an opportunity to just really break the myth of what people think social workers are? I know a lot's been said.
I don't know if it will break the myth, but I want to say that this is an incredibly exciting time to be a social worker.
Yes.
I think that we, the collective we, our membership, social workers throughout the city and the country, are redefining social work in our image of what it should be or what we would like it to be through that RDI lens and through a really broad and inclusive approach to social justice work and social work. So I can't think of a more exciting time to be a social worker.
I want to do this for those who are working in child welfare. You started out by asking us and saying that there's this idea of social workers coming in and taking children. And I just would like to give a little honor to those who have been through child welfare system and those who work in child welfare. It's a thankless job, but it's so incredibly important for the children and families in New York City. And I think that part of my hope is that we will be able to shift this negative perspective that people have and think about them just like we do firemen and police officers. They save lives, and it is going to be sometimes when people do not get saved, but overwhelmingly, people in child welfare save the lives of children.
Well, I want to say saving
families.
it in a different way, because sometimes for a short time or even a long time, it is appropriate to remove people from a very toxic situation.
Yes, absolutely.
So that even if a child is removed from an unsafe, that's a form of saving them.
And I mean it metaphorically, not just like the literal death, life and death, but the emotional life, the future life, the current life, and the life and death. Is that this is what child welfare is for. And we still need to be cognizant of our RDI lens so that we don't traumatize people in doing that. But to villainize a whole group of social workers and people who are not social workers, attorneys, or they are judges, social workers, case managers. And I just like to lift that up for a minute to give us to think about how when we deal with systems, it's very complex, and that we can't villainize folk who are doing the work, because then we burn out people who are doing the work. And so that's part of it. So,
absolutely. Thank you for that. That was a really important point.
And just to piggyback off the two of them, and to highlight something Candida mentioned earlier, is that we are a membership organization, and it's so important that we feel it's so important to push this new agenda that we have. And our new agenda is more grassroots activism oriented, especially since Julie came on board. We've kind of taken a shift. And so I just wanted to say that we love our members, and it's our members who help us push these chapter priorities.
And I'm only building on the work that had already been articulated, but it's an honor to do that, so thank you.
And I've been a member of NASW, the New York City chapter, since I got my master's in social work. All of those social workers out there in New York that are not members of NASW, please contact the New York City chapter and become a member, because as you heard today, really the social workers in general, as well as the work that you are all doing, is just so crucial and needed right now. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work, and personally, as well as, professionally, and for the chapter. And it's been just really wonderful.
And more information can be found on our website at www.naswnyc.org for our programming and our upcoming events.
And what Nzinga didn't say is that we feel like it's really important for people to become members and to stay members. We need that collective strength.
Great.
We really do, to maintain our profession and our integrity. Yeah.
And I would say, in addition to what we do, I appreciate what you're doing, because bringing social work to the forefront is so amazing, and people will come in. So thank you for lifting up the profession.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you for watching Your Voice with Dr. Susan. You can contact us at yourvoice@drsusan.nyc. Thank you.